Yeah, I love the movie I Am Not an Easy Man, and I am absolutely ecstatic to have the panel that we have tonight. The film is really incredible in the way that it depicts sexism and all the overt and covert ways that it shows up in our daily lives. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our panelists tonight who will be diving into the topic of the role of media in shaping and reshaping gender stereotypes. So starting with Michelle King. Michelle is the Director of Inclusion at Netflix, and she is also a leading expert in gender and in organizations, host of the weekly podcast The Fix, and author of a recent book titled The Fix: Overcome the Invisible Barriers That Are Holding Women Back at Work. So she brings a lot of expertise in that realm, and we're excited to hear from her on that. Funa Maduka is the executive producer of I Am Not an Easy Man, as well as the former director of international original films at Netflix, and an awarded filmmaker credited with producing and directing the first Nigerian film to world premiere at the Sundance Film Festival. And she's really the person who, alongside Eléonore, is the driving force behind this movie becoming a reality. And last but certainly not least, Eléonore Pourriat is a French filmmaker, screenwriter, and actress. In 2010, she directed her first short film called Oppressed Majority, which some of you have likely seen because it was viewed more than 15 million times on YouTube throughout the world. And her first feature film as a director was I Am Not an Easy Man, which was released through Netflix in 2018. So starting with a question for the whole panel, we know that film, music, literature, and the arts play a large role in forming our cultural norms everywhere. They can either reinforce the status quo or they can challenge cultural assumptions. So for each of you, I'd love to hear, when was the point for you when you saw film and media as a conduit through which you could challenge the status quo and transform our existing norms and inequalities? And just to have it, just a starting point, we'll go in alphabetical order by first name. So Eléonore.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for inviting me. Well, I must say that as a kid first, I really badly, desperately needed the models. As a girl, I was looking for characters to identify with, and I could find only Mowgli because I looked like him. So it was kind of a desert for little girls like me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one in my generation. It was very hard to find figures to which you could identify, and I remember having this feeling of feeling a lack in culture. And I also remember my shock when I encountered David Bowie's music, which was maybe my first model and the figure of an artist for me, because he had the entire freedom to go from one side of the boundary of gender to another. So he was maybe the first trigger, and then there were Shakespeare comedies, and I think it really was about what interested me was characters who cross-dressed, who were cross-dressers, because they could use this trick to get what they wanted. So I think it always has been on my mind that you had to play with gender if you wanted to get to your goal. So it's not a surprise if in my films I had the idea to use this trick of reversing a world, of flipping gender roles.
Great, thanks. Funa?
Oh, great. Sherry, thank you so much, and Next Gen Men, for having us. I'm so excited to be talking about this film. It's definitely one of the crown jewels of my career while I was at Netflix. I remember the film that most impacted me was Deepa Mehta's Water. I don't know if anyone has seen that film. It is a gorgeous, moving, very emotional film about a group of women in the 1930s who, it's when they become widows, they are basically, I'm going to say, condemned to a life of poverty. And I just remember when I finished that film and seeing just the condition and, you know, because you hear about these things about gender inequality, but seeing that on screen as beautifully as Deepa Mehta portrayed it, it really changed the trajectory of my life. From I immediately became, and I was already working in girls education at the time. And at the time when I watched it, I was working in HIV/AIDS in the Caribbean, and specifically seeing how the disease at the time was very much adversely affecting women because their inability to advocate for themselves and other different social norms that didn't give them the power. It, seeing that depicted on screen just made it all the more real for me. Why this work was so important. And also, I just thought about, like, wow, if this film can affect me like this and make me see an issue all the way, just come back to storytelling and coming back to using that as a powerful tool to shape the way we talk about women and men and how we interact with each other.
Thanks, Funa. Last but not least, Michelle.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having us, Sherry. It's my privilege to be here this evening speaking with all of you. I think to answer your question, from my perspective as a gender equality researcher and somebody who works in this field, I think the role that film can play in really disrupting stereotypes is to actually challenge our the way in which we are conditioned to take stereotypes for granted. So there's a challenging process that I think film and media play in kind of stretching the way we think about it. And so a great example of how this plays out is something Gina Davis recommends, which is, whenever you have a script and you have a main character and it's a male, is to think about literally just switching that character out with a female. And that's normally a good sort of way to kind of disrupt norms and even norms we have in the creative process around, what men and women can do. And so a lot of the work I do and have done in previous roles has really been to challenge some of the gender stereotypes and the default male position as the protagonist or as the hero of the story. And in my own thinking, that really plays out in the work environment in terms of understanding how stereotypes really are handcuffs, gender norms, gender stereotypes, what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine, what it means to be female, what it means to be a woman. Those roles that we play are socially constructed and they are in many ways handcuffs. When we step outside of them, we're penalized. And so for me, the role that film can play is really depicting a different way, for us to engage not only as society, but to also think about ourselves and, what it means to each of us. We know these ingrained stereotypes are actually very prevalent today. I mean, there's research by the Pew Center that shows that roughly 86% of Americans, identify with these gender norms even today. And so, being feminine is really, associated with being meek, mild, unassuming, somebody, who's preoccupied with how they look and their appearance and how they look is more important than what they say. And likewise, being masculine is being brave, unemotive, assertive, dominant, aggressive. And so those norms then play out in the stories we tell and how we tell them. And so I think, there's an opportunity in the way that we tell stories to disrupt the handcuffs and to free us from sort of this ingrained idea of how we should behave and, to really test those assumptions. So I think the Gina Davis rule is a great rule to think about in that creative process because showing people a different way sometimes helps people also question it for themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, the stories we tell and the way that we show up in our culture is really affected by the media that we see. And to that end, Eléonore, you have done an amazing job in this movie of showing the gender stereotypes in such a stark way, from the way that jobs are gendered to the advertising on the streets and in the store windows, the clothing, the decor, even the way that the camera followed Damien. Everything was it was very tangible. You made the sexism that we experience on a day-to-day basis really tangible. How did you go about cataloging and incorporating so many of these stereotypes in the movie and choosing which to highlight subtly and which to highlight overtly? What was the creative process behind that?
Well, first, very simply, when I decided to make to make my short film Oppressed Majority, I wanted to deal with this subject that was affecting my everyday life as a woman. So I didn't have to look for to invent anything. Actually, I had been researching for 40 years when I made my short film as a woman. It was quite easy. I had a catalog on my mind. And when I made the feature film, then I had the possibility to develop a whole world, which was extraordinary, because in a short film, 10-minute film, it was just a chronicle, and I had to choose to pick several situations. But in a feature film, you can really build a realistic world, because that's what I wanted. Actually, I know that it's a reversed world, but I wanted it to be as realistic as possible, because I wanted the viewers to be able to relate to their own world and to go back and forth between the two realities while they were watching the film. So yes, I think it's the accumulation of details which makes the main character a little bit paranoid, and even the viewer at some point is a bit like, there are too many things, but that's how we feel. That's how I feel as a woman, that it's sexism is everywhere, in our language, in our behavior, in the way people talk to us, in the way we act, the way we move, the way we're taught to move. So yes, and also I think this is why men and women maybe don't laugh at the same moments in the film. It's because women recognize things that are not visible in our world, but are very well known from them, and men discover things they wouldn't have imagined. So that was also my first, my first aim was to make visible a world that was not visible for half of the population.
Absolutely. And I also should add, if you have, as audience members, if you have questions for the speakers, we will have a Q&A section. Jake is moderating for that. Please send your questions in the chat directly to Jake so that he can start curating the list of questions for Q&A.
And also, if I can just add something,
sure.
The second major source of inspiration for all those details was also the films I had seen, because it's also a film about how we are used to see men and women represented in films.
Yes.
So yes, I didn't have to invent anything either, because in all the films I had seen as a cinephile, cinema is really the most sexist art. Women and actresses are filmed in a way, their bodies are often objectified, sexualized, and I really wanted to reverse this too, and to film the actors as actresses are usually filmed, to show what it is to film an actor, because that's something that you don't feel when you watch a film, but when you reverse it, it's right on the spot, very visible. When you put a man, when a man wears shorts and you film his legs, you never film a man's legs usually. Or when you, this is also why I chose to do this sequence with the main female character, Alexandra, writing at a place at night topless. I wanted to, I think it was the first time that I was seeing this, a woman writing topless at a place. And we've seen so many guys, you know, having their whiskey and just thinking in films, writers, or I don't know. And yeah, I wanted to, I asked the actress, okay, this scene, we're gonna do this way, if you're okay. And she said, no, I don't wanna be topless. And I told her, it's a political act. And she said, okay, I'll do it.
That's incredible. So Funa, you have been, you know, alongside Eléonore in the journey of making this feature film, because you came across a press majority and you from there made this a possibility through Netflix. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came across a press majority, and then, you know, what happened between that and this feature film coming to life?
Yeah, and I just wanted to add another, Eléonore is so brilliant with detail in that film. One of the things that I loved that she did is the books on the shelf when it was Jane Steinbeck, and that really struck me, because you think about how early we as women are, and even men are taught that the great thinkers are men. And so I just thought, I always like love that little detail that you put on set, Eléonore. And I guess, so I saw the short like you did, Sherry. I saw the short and I fell in love and I wanted more. And so in my seat, I was able to reach out to Eléonore and ask her what she was doing with the short. And I was surprised, actually. I actually called Eléonore expecting for her to tell me, oh, the film's in production, I have a big studio behind me. I thought I was going to have to like really, really fight for the film. Like I was ready. I had my pitch ready. Like, this is why you should, trust me and partner with me. And I was surprised to hear that she had received a lot of no's locally in France. And I was surprised, but I said, all right, we're going to do this. And we held hands and went on this journey together. For almost a year and a half, we were in development. And, just going through, there was some restructuring internally. So I just held the project as I moved from team to team. We didn't have, at the time, a diversity and inclusion initiative. So what was good about Netflix, though, even notwithstanding that, was that it is a culture of risk-taking. It is a culture of finding and defining new audiences. And so it was with that ethos, really, that I was carrying this film until we could go into production and get it greenlit. But it was something that I just knew. I mean, I don't actually really consider myself special in that regard, because 15 million other people obviously saw something in this film around the world. And yeah, I just knew that this was a conversation that needed to happen. And, at the time when the film launched on the service, it's interesting, the timing, because the US had just gone through the peak of Me Too. So it was sort of coming down from that, but still sort of like, it was still in the air and still a relevant conversation. Think pieces were still being written. But what was interesting is that the Me Too movement had just begun to ripple in other places. So Korea, Brazil really responded so strongly to the film when it debuted on the service. And again, all around the world, again, to have people in this global conversation that was happening around women's voices, how they are allowed to show up at work, and in just even in spaces, I thought was super interesting. And Eléonore does this subject so much justice with so much intelligence and grace. And you see that, and I mean, she just obviously said. And I, I was always just, I really loved working with her. And I think that's one of the cool things about when you're a creative executive in that way is working alongside a filmmaker and seeing how they see the world. And it was just one of the greatest experiences for me.
Amazing. We're really lucky that you were one of the 15 million that saw it and were in the position that you were in to make this a reality.
I was lucky because in France we were not ready for this at that time. It's just it's what you said, Funa. It's a question of timing. Because when I made my short film, first I couldn't find money because people would tell me, "Is it really appropriate to make a feminist film in 2010?" And I was like, "Yeah, I think so." But people would be, "Isn't it a bit like, old-fashioned?" And I would say no. And then 4 years later, it had this huge success on YouTube. But still, in the world of cinema in France, there was no real involvement for female filmmakers, and that was the main difference, because Funa had this goal in her mind. I remember when we met the first time, you told me, "I want to change the image of women in cinema." So we had exactly the same objective, the same aim.
I love that. Love that. We definitely need more of this in studios, and that brings me to Michelle. So Michelle, you recently wrote this book called The Fix, and in it you rightly state that it's not women that need to change, it's workplaces that need to change. And you have outlined a few ways that can happen. We can make sexism and inequality visible at home. But would love for you to share a little bit about what we can do in workplaces. The film touches on it a little bit, but would love to hear from you in terms of what we can do in our day-to-day lives to make sexism visible in the workplace.
Yeah, look, I think the starting point, and I'll try and keep it really simple, is to understand how inequality works in workplaces. And I use the word inequality very purposely. So, workplaces are not designed for difference. They're by and large designed for what I call the Don Draper ideal, right? So in 1950s, white, middle class, heterosexual, able-bodied male. And so that creates challenges for anybody who differs from that ideal, because the more ways that you differ, the more barriers you're going to face trying to advance at work. Because the Don Draper standard, even in workplaces today, research finds is the standard for what good looks like when it comes to leadership, management. We naturally associate that ideal standard as being the standard for leadership. And so for women in particular, the more they really differ, the harder it is. And so my book outlines that is the basis for inequality in workplaces. And as a result, women face, my book outlines 17 different barriers. Even once they're in leadership positions, there's, barriers that they face just trying to lead. And so I think the starting point is, understanding how inequality works in workplaces, understanding the barriers that women face, how this differs for all women. So, while it might be hard for white women to advance, they have their whiteness in common with Don, and that makes it that much easier for them to advance, right, compared to racial ethnic minority women. And so I think it's really important to understand how the barriers differ for women, how difference compounds those barriers and makes them different in many instances. So that's really important part of getting to know inequality. But the thing we don't talk about, and it's something my research found that kind of even surprised me, because it was definitely an area I had not thought of, and the first to admit this, is I assume that the system worked for men. So, and that's a fair assumption. You think, the Don Draper standard, surely it must work for men, but it doesn't. So something I found is that, living up to the Don Draper ideal in workplaces creates tremendous challenges for men. Men are silenced and bullied and encouraged not to speak up and to live up to this masculine heroic image that I talked about before. And, you know, that's deeply ingrained. And when men deviate from that, they're stigmatized. They're seen as being less sort of ambitious, less career focused, and it can create tremendous challenges for men. So that's why I say it's important we start with understanding like how inequality plays out in organizations, in industries. What are the barriers that women face? But importantly, what are the barriers that men face? Because once we see that, we start to see each other. And we start to understand that actually your fight is my fight and we're in this together. It might play out a little differently for each of us, but the system that we've been given and the system that's set up in workplaces doesn't allow us to be ourselves. And as a result, we're not as creative as we could be because we're not bringing our whole selves to work. And so that's really what this is about for me, is freedom. You know, the freedom to be yourself at work and to be valued for that. And I just want to say to any women who are listening to this, you know, something we don't often say to women is that, you know, you deserve the right to work in an organization that values you, and you deserve the right to be seen for who you are. And the skills and the creativity and the innovation that women bring in terms of their capabilities are needed today, but importantly are going to be, you know, needed to a much greater extent in the future world of work, where that innovation, that problem solving, that creativity, that democratic leadership, we're seeing it play out now with COVID, you know, at 19, where women leaders are engaging in a much more relational style that's proving to be a lot more effective in a crisis. And so I really encourage women to lean into that side of themselves and those strengths on average. And I encourage men to, you know, be brave enough to explore what it means to be a man at work and to step into different aspects of themselves rather than following this conditioning we've been given.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to ask one last question of the whole panel, and then we're going to turn it over to audience questions because I know that there's some really good ones out there. So last question for me, what are some things that the film industry isn't doing enough of in order to promote gender equality as our norm? And what are the things that they could or should be doing in order to correct for the inequalities that you've all named?
Eleanor, you want to go first?
Oh, you go ahead.
Well, I guess to jump off what Michelle was saying, I think it's a really important point that she's making. And I think for a lot of studios, and I say this quite emphatically, it's not enough, you know, to look around your room and congratulate yourself because 50% of the room is women, or you know, 50% of the room are people of color or transgender. That's great. That's a first step. But I think the next step is, do those people at the table feel comfortable then sharing their voices? Because I think there's a lot of the times it's just statistics that go out across the industry focus on numbers, and everyone congratulates them for getting their diversity number up. And I think that's where the inclusion comes in, because you are then absolutely getting people in the room who feel bold and who feel like they can contribute, who feel that they can say, no, actually that storyline is offensive. Hey, maybe we should think about, you know, bringing other women directors to the table to be able to pitch for this film. Because I think what I have seen, and even speaking to colleagues across the industry, is that a lot of times those who come into those like me, Black women, Latino women, transgender women, even though we may get a seat at the table, it's not always easy to speak. And I think it's really important for the industry to look into that, because, you know, I gave this TED talk on decolonizing cinema. And when you think about what I mean by decolonizing cinema, it means that up until this time, we've had a very Western ideal and Western-centric and Hollywood-centric way of looking at media, and that and films from that canon are what have kind of dictated what we see. And that has come with some good, and that has also come with some bad. We've seen the influence of what are primarily patriarchal societies seeping into and influencing cultures that were not necessarily patriarchal to begin with, and shifting the way that sexes, races relate to one another. And so, I think what's interesting about, where we are right now in the media space, particularly with COVID-19, as theaters are shut down and everyone is mostly experiencing content through streaming, I hope it underscores the importance more than ever that we don't port a lot of the biases that we saw in the terrestrial realm onto then the online realm. I want us to kind of leave all of that behind, shed all of those biases, and make sure that the content that we are taking out into the world are really introducing a new and inclusive view, such that we had the groundbreaking Oscar win from Parasite out of Korea this year, such that that is not just an only and a first, but we're seeing films from around the world, from different perspectives, from different voices, and then digging deeper to really make sure, again, like that's the first layer, and then there are gender issues in all of these countries that we have to break and dismantle, and class issues and all of those different things, and really making sure that we get to a point where we do have a sort of global inclusion in that way. But it does really begin in that room with those executives, and ensuring that, if you have that person in the room, don't just pat yourself in the back because they are in the room. Really, really push yourself, especially if you're in the leadership seat in that room, to get everyone to feel comfortable speaking, because it's not always the case.
Yeah.
In many countries, they're not in many countries they're not in the room yet.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
I would also add that we really need quotas. For in selection committees, and in France there are all those fantastic state aids, state money, but in the commissions there are mostly men. So we really need parity everywhere, in the festivals, in the networks, of course, in the channels. I know that it's people are more aware of this in the States, but I can tell you that in France it's still like slow.
Yeah, and you're so right. Film festival selection committees, film critics, most film critics
exactly,
are men.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We need more women transgender critics reviewing films at many of these major publications, because again, it's that gaze that dictates often the success of a film, and the rise or fall of a woman filmmaker's career. Absolutely. You're so spot on, Eléonore.
Yeah. Michelle, you're still muted.
Sorry, hi. I have a slightly different take on it because I'm not a massive fan of quotas. I've done quite a lot of research in this area, and they can be quite detrimental with having, and it's actually, for me, I was like, if we're going to put quotas on anything, let's put quotas on the dominant group and set limits on how much you default to the white male leader making up groups, and really, challenging that assumption. But I think as soon as we focus on representation, there's an assumption that somehow that takes care of the inclusion side of it, and that's just not what we see. So in organizations that have what we call cultures of equality, where leaders behave in a way and support their employees in a way that allows them to be themselves at work and to be valued for that, women are 6 times more likely to rise to senior leadership positions, and men are twice as likely. And the reason for that is because you're no longer advancing a small number of people that fit this outdated ideal of what good looks like. Everybody's got an opportunity to make it. And so for me, I think what's missed right now is that actually it's the lived experience of inequality that creates a lot of the barriers to people's advancement in the industry. And so one way to tackle this is starting at an individual level. You know, when we think about inclusion, what is everybody on this video conference tonight going to go away from here and do themselves to try and address some of these systemic barriers? What work are we going to own as individuals? What are we personally going to do to educate ourselves about the barriers and to think about how we can play a role every day in either removing or reinforcing these barriers by ignoring them? And so for myself as a white woman, I'm confronted with how white women often reinforce the barriers that women from racial and ethnic minorities experience in organizations, because they don't take active steps to understand things that play out from a gendered racist perspective in organizations. And so for me, it's really about thinking through, you know, what are the challenges that groups other than myself are facing, and what is it that I can do to remove some of those barriers, and how can I show up every day? And I think if everybody did that, you know, and took individual accountability for the inequality that exists in systems, you know, we could go really far. And importantly, I think leaders play a critical role in this, because they drive the culture of these institutions that ultimately are unequal and have these systemic barriers in place. And, you know, culture starts with leaders. The inequality that any underrepresented group experiences in organizations is a direct result of leadership. So for me, there's an opportunity to actually start shedding light on what these barriers are, have women share their stories of inequality, what I call inequality moments, the day-to-day experiences, whether it's a sexist comment or a boss telling you to wash the dishes or whatever it is, right? Those microaggressions in meetings or being underrepresented, you know, like use those moments as teaching moments to share the barriers that we experience and make commitment to take action. So for me, I won't be on a panel unless the panel is diverse. There's certain rules I have and things I do to try and break some of the barriers that exist for other groups in organizations. Yeah. And so I think individual accountability is the key to try and drive systemic change.
I have a question.
I love the idea. Oh, sorry.
Michelle, because I guess I'm trying to tie what you and Eléonore are saying, because I know in the very beginning, quotas were very effective in at least like getting people in the door. But I do agree, like quotas in absence of the other work don't actually make a difference. Like it's great to have the women in the room. So is there, because I think, Eléonore, I don't want to, but I wonder sometimes like if there is a benefit. And I think quotas is also a very charged word, but I know benchmarks may be a more acceptable term maybe, but thinking about, because I don't want people to walk away saying no to benchmark, because I do think that we should have a goal to get people into the room. Like people should have something in mind, and then from there, and don't stop the work by just getting them in the room. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, like I never used to have a strong opinion on quotas until I researched it myself as part of my PhD. And what I found was that quotas actually lead to tokenism. So this belief that you're being in the position because you're a minority. And as a result, what we find is women have to overperform in those positions to be seen as just as competent as sort of an average male peer. And women themselves, there's a lot of gaslighting that happens where they doubt their own capability because they were placed into that role. And irrespective of the individual impact, when you look at sort of over time, it's a short-term solution to what is a long-term problem. So the long-term problem, like when we come back to what is the problem we're trying to solve for, it's not actually representation. It's the issue that we don't value men and masculinity in the same way that we value women and femininity. And as a result, that's the problem we're trying to solve for. And so it's like looking at the scoreboard and ignoring the game. And the game is the lived experience that women encounter. You can have a seat at the table, but not be valued for it. I've worked in teams that are diverse, but not inclusive, and inclusive, but not diverse. So there's no guarantee either way that you're going to change the lived experience. And that's why I was quoting that Accenture study, which shows when you actually change the lived experience, that's when we see the increase in representation. But I don't want to take away from what Eléonore was saying. There, you know, representation matters. So it is important and it is a focus. I sometimes struggle with putting a number on it because, you know, that seems quite arbitrary, like X percentage of women is acceptable or X percentage. And then you have people who say, well, it should represent the communities in which we live. That's also weird because in a lot of communities you have men in leadership roles. It just feels weird placing a number on it. But I do think representation matters, and I'm not taking away from that. I would just love to see more of a focus on the hard stuff rather than these quick fixes basis of let's just put a woman in leadership. Because what we find is when women are in leadership positions, you know, they're 50% more likely to be replaced by a male, irrespective of their performance. And that's because we default to the Don Draper ideal as what good looks like. So it doesn't result in what we see sort of sustainable change. Those women leaders are also tasked with having to solve the lived experience of inequality disproportionately, and then penalized for solving it when they do. So like it doesn't really result in the systemic change that we hope it does. And I often think that quotas are like the last resort. It's when women are really fed up and they're like, well, just mandate it. Just get more women in here because women will fix it, and having more women in will fix it. But that's simply not the case. I think there's a role for enrolling men and male leaders in this process. And I think the key to that is getting them to see that inequality actually hurts them. And actually there's a benefit to them as individuals in creating a more equal system where they can be themselves at work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're saying very much the same thing. I think it's numbers are not enough.
Numbers are not enough. Yeah.
Not enough. And it's sort of the easiest thing you can do to do that mandate. And then you really, really have to make sure, like you're saying, that the work is inclusive. And I also I like that stat about women being replaced by men, because I often think sometimes when you have a really excellent woman, we still treat her as an aberration, and so well that was her, you know, and so then we look at.
Yeah. We are going a little bit longer. Hopefully that's okay with all of you. I know we have some questions from the audience that we want to get to as well. So Jake, do you want to take it and share the first question from the audience?
You bet. I turned on my camera here, so I'm not a pictureless voice. We got some really good questions. Obviously, we're a bit short on time, so I'm going to try and squeeze in as many as possible. The first one goes to Eléonore, and the question is, have you received any angry reactions from this film, and what specifically did they not like about it?
Actually, I've probably received many angry reactions, but I haven't read them. It was I can tell you that I have received many because I have received many for my short film. You know, there was this discussion on YouTube, and I received so many threats and crazy violence. So I imagine that it's the same and maybe worse with the feature film, but I chose not to go, you know, to those forums, etc. Yeah, you know, with the short film, the angry reactions were not very interesting. It was just hatred. No, the messages I received for the feature film were more positive comments. People find me on social media to tell me they saw the film, and there are many men from everywhere who write to say that they didn't imagine it was such a mess.
Yeah. Maybe to build on that, first of all, I think that like Teflon and ignoring those kinds of things is a good practice for your mental health. So kudos to you on that.
You know, I couldn't imagine that a 10-minute film would trigger such crazy reactions. So I protected myself when the feature film was released.
Yeah, I think it's probably for the best, but maybe digging a little bit deeper into an interesting question. Is there, and I was thinking about this when you were explaining this as well, because I watched the film by myself before this conversation, and you had said that there was scenes where men and women react totally differently. Mm-hmm. And I was imagining to myself, what scene might that have been if my partner was watching with me? So is there a scene that you are pretty certain that it's just very different how they react, that you could point out maybe to us?
Maybe the scene where the couple goes to his place, and she discovers his hair on the chest, or very actually very intimate details, which we women have to, to like problems we have to handle every day, and men don't even know where we need to do so many things to please them.
Fair enough. I do have a note here that Michelle unfortunately does have a hard stop here in 1 minute. If it's okay with the other panelists, I don't know if you have a little bit of flexibility.
Sure.
But
sorry, everyone, I have to put my kids to bed, so I'm just owning madness that is COVID-19. I've got a sitter and she has to go, so I've got to put them to bed. So
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Totally understand.
No problem at all.
Yeah.
We're all bringing our whole selves to this Zoom chat. Michelle, I know you got to run, so I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure to have you on the panel, share your insights, and I'm looking forward to future conversations between Anti-Sexist Social Club and Netflix, and we'll let you go so that you're not hanging around with us.
Thank you for having me, and
Thank you,
Eléonore,
Thank you
congratulations.
so much, Michelle.
Congratulations. Bye.
Awesome. Funa, Eléonore, do you still have a few minutes? Just
Sure.
okay.
Just checked in with my dog. He's okay, but he needs his walk.
Okay, fair enough. I promise not to go too long. We'll get maybe 2 questions and then we'll wrap it up if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
So an interesting question here. When you were saying, Eléonore, that France wasn't ready for this film, it's funny because oftentimes we think of Europe as maybe more progressive as than North America. And yourself, Funa, and Eléonore, what have you noticed as the different cultural reactions to this film?
Well, I would say that France is more obviously sexist, maybe, than North American countries. I live in New York, so I can compare the two cultures, and yes, I think maybe it's more hidden here in New York, and more obvious, and décomplexé, we say in France, like, guys don't embarrass themselves with any awareness or any, well, it's better, it's getting better. And since the Me Too movement, there's a real change. But when I started to write the film, and when I made my short film, it was still very, very conservative. I mean, it's the paradox of France, where we're seen as a very loose country in terms of love, etc. But it's a very sexist way of seeing relationships between men and women, where actually women have to please men and men decide. Mm-hmm. And what, I don't know if you remember this tribune there was in a newspaper where Catherine Deneuve said we have the right to be, whistled in the street, etc. She's our icon, like the most famous French actress. She's huge, and she said something which was so conservative.
Wow. Funa, how about yourself?
As far as
cultural reactions to the film, maybe differences.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised by anything that Eléonore has said. I know that, when the film hit, I think I highlighted here, like Korea and Brazil really, really responded to it, because in Korea, their Me Too movement was starting. In Brazil, they had their issue. I can't remember what the name of their movement was, but it was also something that was really coming to the forefront. So people really took to the film in different parts of the world. India, obviously, I think that India responded very strongly to the short and was a strong audience for the feature as well. But around the world, and I think the other thing that was interesting is that even as progressive as we may think the U.S. is, it was so interesting to compare it to the stages women are in other parts of the world. And so there was oftentimes an even deeper resonance in places where some of the progress we've been able to make in the United States is not felt in other countries. And to what Eléonore was saying, around the comments of Catherine Deneuve, I think there's something that happens in gender equality and the evolution of thought, so much that the oppressed take on the mindset of the oppressor, right? And so you saw that in the United States, and how women had to break out of what they were told what it means to be a woman is, right? And so you see that that response for a lot of women around the world. And what was great about the film, like when I was reading some of the tweets at the time that when the film went live, was you saw that spark in a lot of women saying like, and when they're just realizing and almost awakening to their own feminism, right? Because we can't always just assume that women are feminists, right? And so women then awakening to their own inner feminists as well, and sort of breaking free from their bondage of how they were seeing the world.
Yeah,
Totally.
and I think this is why probably the film works very good in macho cultures. There's probably a relief for women to see such a film.
Right.
That
Yeah,
makes a lot of sense.
It's the other thing too I want to just add, because I thought I was watching the Michelle Obama doc, and she talked about how people said that because America at the time President Obama was elected, that racism would be gone because we have a Black president. And I think it's very much the same as Eléonore was saying in mature countries that talk about, oh, but women can go to work and women can, do this and they can do that. And so there's this assumption, therefore, that sexism is gone. And so the brilliance of Eléonore Pourriat is that she was able to show us that, okay, yes, you have lovely window coverings. Let's open that and see what's really inside the house. And so I think that's the thing that I really loved about just the layers and the complexity with the film, that just delivers this message, is that we have more work to be done.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, I'm squeezing in one more question. To those who submitted questions, I apologize that I won't get to more, but this one will hopefully give us more things, inspiring things to look at. Someone asked, as two cinephiles here with us, what other movie recommendations do you have for this audience that's kind of curious about looking at the world this way?
Well, I was talking first when we started the discussion about those films that had inspired me as a teenager or young adult, where I could see strong female characters because they were cross-dressing. And I really remember Sylvia Scarlett by George Cukor with Katharine Hepburn, which was like something very important for me, because she was so bold, and it was so rare to see a bold woman in those films of the 40s. And yes, there are also I'm thinking of those films with a lot of tenderness, because they probably shaped me and shaped my awareness. There's also, Yentl by Barbara Streisand, who also cross-dresses to be able to study. and yeah. And I'm thinking also of a film that has nothing to do with cross-dressing or anything, but which offers an extraordinary perspective on intimacy and on desire, which is totally free from the patriarchal yoke. It's a documentary by Ariana Pintillier called Touch Me Not. It's absolutely brilliant. It won, I think, an award in Berlin like 2 years ago, 3 years ago. It's a more recent film. It's extraordinary. It's really about intimacy and desire, and it's wonderful.
Amazing. I think I wrote those down, so we'll definitely email them out to the group after. And how about yourself, Funa?
Wow, okay, I'm gonna start. So the one film I said, Deepa Mehta's Water, I think is stunning. I would also recommend just the films of Agnes Varda. And I think, gosh, what else? Oh, they're like escaping from my head as I'm thinking about them. I should have written it down. I was thinking as Eléonore was speaking, but I would just do a Google search. I think there's a lot of people who've done really great jobs, like curating films that are strong female lead. Unfortunately, they have literally just run out of my mind right now. But the other one I talk about a lot is Elizabeth by Shekhar Kapoor. I think that was really fascinating to watch a woman sort of navigate her way into such a powerful position. I love all the Elizabeth films. And I guess, there have been more contemporary works. I thought Bombshell was interesting last year. I thought it was interesting because I didn't understand news media and how the inner workings of it. And so I felt the film was illuminating for me in that way. I wish I had written down more, but if anyone needs to know, ping me and I'll give you a list. I'll send you a list.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic to Sherry and she's going to bring us home.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jake. So Anti-Sexist Social Club, as Jake mentioned in the beginning, for all of us, our motto here is that it's not enough to say, I'm not sexist. We all have to be anti-sexist, and that requires action. So Eléonore and Funa, if you could recommend or give homework or, just share your advice on what are some things that our audience could do to promote, equality or correct inequality, what would be some things that you would share with them?
I would say that the most important thing is education. It's the root of everything. So we need to raise our kids beyond the boundaries of gender, without this fake cultural construction that imprisons them. So it's true, yes, for home education by parents and what happens in school too.
Yeah.
And also, I would say that recently we've seen so many women's groups flourishing everywhere, and I think it's wonderful because I think women have also are now aware that they're stronger together, which has taken a lot of time because we had been taught that we were enemies.
So I have a easy, fun thing, which I think was premised by. Sorry, he is getting antsy. Okay. So a really easy thing I think is to watch films by women filmmakers, transgender filmmakers, and stream those films and make a conscious decision to do so. And I say this because, you know, a lot of these companies, they look at ticket sales, they look at number of streams, they look at all of those different things. And so if we want to see more voices as an audience, we need to show up for those stories. And a lot of times they're super enjoyable. They're really great. You know, during my time while I was at Netflix, I greenlit a lot of films from women directors, and it wasn't just because they were women, or even because they were women. It's because the films were great. And so I really think that we as an audience, a very easy thing that we can do as we sit on our couches during COVID-19 and you're looking for something to zone out to and just chill and relax and not think about the stresses of the day, you can still be an activist in that decision by what you choose to watch. So take a moment, go to the info page, look at who is directing, learn more about her, they, him, the perspective that they're bringing from different cultures around the world. Watch a film that's not in your native language. Do those things, because that simple act will start to break down barriers, because the people who are making the decisions are like, oh, there's an audience for that. And that is a really simple, powerful form of activism that I encourage everyone. And you guys have already done it today by watching Eléonore's film. So congrats, and do more of it.
Thank you, Funa. I think that's the perfect note to end on. Thank you all for joining us as the audience, and thank you so much, Funa and Eléonore, for gracing us with your insights and your perspective and your advice. So hopefully we'll have all of you back for future events, and you know, thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Funa, for this conversation.
Give that dog a walk.
Yes, he is. Want to say hi, Niles? Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.